The film begins with a professional stop-motion animator. The audience is introduced to the animation studio of Suzanne Blake, who claims to be a seasoned veteran in stop-motion filmmaking. The process of creating stop-motion animation involves photographing every tiny movement of a clay puppet built around an internal armature that functions like a skeleton. When the frames are played in sequence, the result is a smooth, flowing film that gives lifeless figures a second chance to move again. Suzanne was once at the top of her craft, almost legendary in her prime. But arthritis has started affecting her hands, and she can no longer execute the intricate movements she once mastered. Her daughter Ella inherited her talent, and is also highly skilled at bringing inanimate objects to life with human-like motion. Suzanne wants Ella to complete her final project, a story about a cyclops, and decides to mentor her directly. She is extremely controlling and often harsh. Ella has no real life outside the studio because of the immense pressure from her mother. She spends long hours following Suzanne's strict instructions or assisting with daily tasks, since her mother still maintains tight control over her life. The only time Ella gets any freedom is when Suzanne is asleep, allowing her to leave the apartment, see her boyfriend Tom, and try to interact with the outside world. During one of their sessions in the studio, Suzanne suffers a heart attack and falls into a coma. After taking her mother to the hospital, Ella decides to finish the project and continue filming. Soon, she begins experiencing disturbing visions. At one point she imagines her mother dead in the apartment, then sees what looks like a structure beneath her skin made of flesh, bone, and tendons. A young girl appears near the apartment, and eventually enters the studio, expressing deep fascination with Ella's stop-motion films. Finally feeling seen, Ella shows her mother's latest film and explains in detail how it was made. But the girl dismisses the Cyclops story and claims she has a better one. She tells a tale about a frightened girl lost in the wilderness and hunted by an unknown creature. Before leaving, the child suggests that Ella use mortician's wax, the kind used to conceal wounds and imperfections on corpses, on the frightened girl character. Ella ignores the suggestion and instead dives back into her mother's research, trying to understand the source of her own fear that day. She imagines a forest and briefly loses consciousness, only to wake up with Tom standing in her apartment, checking on her. When she regains her senses, Ella notices that the child's story has begun replacing her mother's original concept. New settings appear, including a forest and a frightened girl shaped by wax. It feels as though Ella is discovering her own creative voice. She decides to abandon Suzanne's project entirely, focus on her own ideas, and discard the old sets. Around the same time, Polly, Tom's sister, visits the studio and offers Ella a job at their stop-motion production company. Polly also comments that drug use seems to have enhanced Ella's creative process. When the young girl returns, Ella proudly shows her how she's bringing the story to life. To make it more realistic, the child makes a shocking request: the frightened girl should be made from raw flesh. At first, Ella objects, explaining that it would clash with the earlier wax scenes, but eventually she agrees, seeing it as a sign that her work is evolving. She also creates the antagonist, a man who stalks the frightened girl, using raw meat, naming him the Ash Man because the child originally formed his figure out of ash. The girl continues the story, describing how the frightened girl hides from the Ash Man in a cabin deep in the woods. She stops after 3 nights, when the Ash Man knocks on the door. Ella films up to that moment. Later that night, she hears knocking at her own apartment door. The child returns and takes her outside, suggesting that the Ash Man appears in the form of death itself, and wears the skin and flesh of a dead fox. This is where Ella finally draws a line. The increasingly disturbing demands are too much. The girl leaves angrily after mocking her and refuses to reveal what happened during those 3 nights. Determined to prove the film is hers, Ella tries repeatedly to develop the plot on her own but struggles. She visits Suzanne in the hospital, where her condition is pitiful, and admits she feels creatively empty and lost. Later, she meets Polly at a club and decides to use drugs again to relax. During an intense hallucination, Ella sees, hears, and feels signs of threat and aggression surrounding her, while also sensing the presence and body of Tom, the man she loves. After that, she carefully measured the dimensions to further refine her creations. Ella guided her hands while the young girl described a bleeding wound belonging to a man who had been involved in a bar fight, as Ella followed the child despite her confused mental state. This time, she listened to her advice and brought a fox's corpse home to portray the Ash Man in a more graphic and savage way. Before leaving, the girl told the story of how the Ash Man noticed the frightened girl on the first night. Ella was then overwhelmed with terror when she discovered a real-life version of her grotesque creation visiting her apartment. She fainted from fear, and Tom woke her up the next morning. He assumed her experience was just a drug-induced hallucination after she confessed how scared she was. However, Ella later realized she hadn't taken anything at all. Terrified, she decided to leave the studio and spend the night with Tom, stepping away from her work for a while. Even at Tom's house, Ella struggled to sleep because of nightmares about her creations coming to life and hurting her. Eventually, she started to feel better after accepting a new job at the stop-motion production company where Polly works. Still, she was forced to confront a disturbing past she had tried to escape. She discovered that Polly had taken her story about the frightened girl and recreated it at the company in a distorted yet commercially acceptable way. Enraged, Ella caused chaos at work and was immediately fired. Frustrated and disoriented, she went to the hospital to see Suzanne, who was still in a coma. In an imagined conversation, she opened up about her struggles. She felt immense pressure, afraid of what would happen if she didn't finish the film, and equally afraid of what would happen if she did. In that hallucinated exchange, her mother mocked her, saying she had no control over her terrifying imagination, then seemed to pity her. Ella returned to the studio to film the second night's scene and learned, according to the girl's story, that the Ash Man had touched the frightened girl that night. Determined to change the outcome, Ella rewrote the story so the frightened girl could avoid her fate. The child objected, but Ella insisted it was her story and she had the right to shape it however she wanted. That's when the Ash Man came to life and began stalking Ella. She shifted symbolically between herself and the frightened girl as the deeper meaning of the story intensified. Eventually, he caught and tortured her. Just before losing consciousness, she saw the young girl mocking her attempt to alter the narrative. Ella later woke up in the hospital with a wound on her leg and got into an argument with Tom, who believed her mental health was deteriorating because of the frightening things she was saying. Tom decided to destroy the entire film and all its components, but Ella begged him to stop and swore she would put an end to it herself. She couldn't even cry for Suzanne on her deathbed, as the young girl, who seemed destined to return to hell, had become completely intertwined with the film Ella was obsessed with. The child commented that the project needed something more alive and more bloody, using fox flesh. In a final desperate attempt to escape her fate, Ella returned to the studio. She tried to strangle the girl, realizing she was just a product of her own fractured imagination, but she couldn't bring herself to kill her. With no hope left, she surrendered to the horrific fate ahead. The girl reassured her that things would get better while expressing fear about what might happen on the third night after the Ash Man's arrival. She encouraged Ella to peel off her own skin to transform the grotesque creations even further, claiming that all great artists embed a part of themselves into their work. When Tom and Polly arrived at the apartment, they were shocked to see her behaving erratically. They couldn't stop her. She brutally killed them both in a state of madness. The young girl was pleased, having gained the chance to corrupt Ella's art even more. Under a trance-like state, Ella reshaped the frightened girl and the Ash Man into lifelike versions made from the corpses of her victims. On the third night, she confronted the Ash Man, who appeared to have lost all will or ability to resist. Facing her deepest fear, Ella carved into her own face, now resembling mortician's wax, and offered it to the monstrous creature as a final act. The scene ends with the Ash Man devouring Ella, evoking Francisco Goya's painting, Saturn devouring his son, though the reference carries a slightly different meaning here. In the final moments, the young girl sits at home watching the completed stop-motion film, which concludes with Ella's death in the real world. The last scene unfolds in Ella's imagined forest. After the girl congratulates her on finishing the project, Ella finally feels a sense of satisfaction and climbs into a box, just as Suzanne once said puppets do when their useful life is over. And that's how the film ends. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.